So we are hosting this webinar as we have hosted some other webinars in just this year, and we will continue doing so. I wanted just to briefly introduce to you some of the things that we've done and maybe a couple of things briefly mentioned that are upcoming. So past guest webinars include David Peter Stroh and his approach to systems thinking for social change. Just so you know, David is actually one of the founders of the Innovation Associates with Peter Senge, which was the basis for the fifth discipline work that you might be familiar with. And his focus in our conversation with him was a lot on some of the systemic issues that we see happening today, what's going on in the world, and what are the potential avenues that we could look at for solutions. What are some of the leverage points? What are the things that we might think about in terms of systems orientation? So it's a very sort of looking at some of the current events and current challenges and having a framework for understanding that. Later on, and just a couple months ago, I say later on, so soon after that, we're very pleased to have Umberto Maturana join us. And if you've read any of or some of Fritjof's work or Dr. Capra's work, you might have seen Dr. Maturana's name come up. He's a Chilean biologist who had come up with the term of autopoiesis, understanding the systems more fully in terms of what it is about life that makes life existence. I think he said something to the effect of he noticed that when he was a child that something had died, and he then questioned, well, what does it mean to live, right? And so his work in biology was attuned to that and made his way more further into systems and what we call structural determinism. But one of the key things he came up with was the idea of autopoiesis, which is around a system basically having its own unity and the ability to sort of self-determine its own sort of operations through the relationships within that system. I'm probably misstating things a little bit, and Dr. Capra can clear that up a little bit when he speaks a little bit further. But he's made great contributions to the concept of systems thinking, so we were very fortunate to have a webinar with him earlier this year. The things that are upcoming, organizational learning workshop series, these are things that we've been holding. We've already had one of them, and that was a systems thinking program that our own Peter Senge and Robert Steele helped to lead. And that was a workshop, so not a webinar, but an actual workshop. And this is one of the 5 disciplines from Peter Senge. And so we're going to be covering all 5 disciplines, just so you know. We have the mental models workshop on the 22nd of August. I'll be covering that at the end of this webinar. So if you're interested in joining that, please stick around to find out more information. Again, that'll be coming up on the 22nd of August. But the other disciplines that you might know of already are personal mastery, which will come up after that, about approximately a month to a month and a half, shared vision, and team learning. If you'd like more information, while the mental models program isn't yet posted on the website, you'll find a lot of other information on the website by going to solsingapore.org, where you can also join up as a member. Okay, so that is a little bit of introduction. I also wanted just to plug, and Dr. Capra, you can mention this later on if you want to as well, but your own program that you have coming up in the fall, which I'm very much looking forward to, the Systems View of Life course, and you can find that at capracourse.net. I wasn't sure if he wanted me to list that here, but I went ahead and just said it. So I'm very much looking forward to experiencing that with you, so thank you. Before we go on with the rest of the program, I wanted to introduce the process that's here, and I'm going to introduce the panel in a moment as well. Obviously, you see Tara Kimbrell Cole. I will introduce her more fully in a moment, but she is the president of SoL Singapore. So what we're going to be looking at in terms of process and agenda for the program is, obviously, we're in the welcome stage, and at approximately 15 minutes after, I don't know where we're at in the process, we're almost there, we're going to hear from Tara and introducing both SoL as well as Dr. Capra, and then we will have Dr. Capra presenting for about 20 to 25 minutes, as long as you'd like to, Dr. Capra. It's up to you.
Fine.
And then we'll have a Q&A that will come through in the chat. So there's a Q&A box, sorry, not the chat, but the Q&A box is specific to that. So please use that Q&A box so we can make sure to cover some questions. Now, we've come up with some questions ourselves, and I'm sure that Tara has come up with some questions she wants to ask Dr. Capra, as well as I. So we're going to be in that process with Dr. Capra, but I wanted just to allow you guys or open it up to you to submit your own questions that you might have, so that we can make sure to field them. Now, they're not going to be visible to everybody. So we are unfortunately not going to be able to answer everybody's questions, but, or respond to everybody's questions. But, you know, we will filter through and see what we can do in the short time that we have. And then I'll cover the summary of upcoming events. I've already mentioned that, or summarize what we've discussed in upcoming events, and then we'll close at approximately 90 minutes after. Okay. I would ask if there are any questions, but since I can't hear any of you, we'll just move forward.
Garrett,
yes,
can
Dr.
we
Capra.
do first names? Can we do first names? I'm more comfortable. My name is Fritjof.
Absolutely.
The name is Norwegian, but I'm Austrian.
Okay. Yes. You know that you're born in Austria, but it's good to know. Norwegian. I didn't realize your name was Norwegian. You have
Right.
heritage from Norwegian. Excellent. Norway. So good. Fritjof. Absolutely. Absolutely. First names. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So where are we now? All right. So I'm going to introduce briefly Tara, who will then introduce SoL a little bit more. So what I'd like to say about Tara is that she's been basically the foundation of what we do here in Singapore. She founded the group, SoL Singapore, and has been the president and chair, doing a wonderful job of helping us to figure out what direction we're going and how do we, you know, try to make the difference that we would like to make in the world, both in Singapore as well as in the region and as part of the global SoL community. She has been a organizational learning and systems thinker for the past 16 years and has been an executive prior to that. So I'll leave it there and turn it over to Tara to go ahead and introduce Fritjof and get us started. Thank you.
Thank you, Garrett. It's a real pleasure to welcome all of you to this webinar with Fritjof Capra, hosted by Society for Organizational Learning, also known as SoL Singapore. Just want to have a few words about us. Our purpose is to discover, integrate, and implement theories and practices for the interdependent development of people, their institutions, and society, founded on Peter Senge's 5 disciplines of organizational learning, the 5th of which is systems thinking, as Garrett was saying. We're an educational platform offering learning opportunities that, to our knowledge, are not available in the region. We are one of 12 member communities of the Global Association of SoL Communities, known as Global SoL, and we're a member-governed Singapore Registered Society. Global SoL is an international learning community composed of organizations, consultants, researchers in local SoL communities around the world. It's a not-for-profit member-governed organization. Global SoL serves as a space in which individuals and institutions can create together that which they cannot create alone. We at SoL Singapore are truly honored to have Dr. Fritjof Capra with us in conversation today. Fritjof is a world-renowned scientist, an encyclopedic scholar, and author of a new science paradigm and systems theory. He is considered one of the most important systems thinkers of our time, and perhaps the most important science philosopher today. He is also highly respected for his ability to communicate and integrate concepts across scientific disciplines. He completed his doctoral degree in theoretical physics at the University of Vienna. He's taught at universities across the Western world, from the University of Paris, Universities of California, Santa Cruz and Berkeley, Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center, and all the way to the Imperial College of London. Austrian by birth, Dr. Capra is fluent in German, English, French, and Italian. and he is the founding director of the Center for Ecoliteracy in Berkeley, California, that promotes ecological and systems thinking in primary and secondary education. Ecoliteracy means the understanding of ecological communities, also known as ecosystems, and then the use of these principles for creating sustainable communities. In science, this is systems thinking, fundamental to which is the recognition that every living system is a network. A prolific writer, he's authored and co-authored over 20 books, which have been translated in all the major languages and are global bestsellers. I'll mention just a few. The Tao of Physics, 1975, in which Dr. Capra breaks new ground by asserting that both physics and metaphysics lead inexorably to the same knowledge. They are two visions of the universe that complement one another. The Turning Point in 1982, which was the basis of the film Mind Walk in 1990 with Liv Ullmann, John Hurd, and Sam Waterston, and turned into an entire movement by the year 2000 in the United States. Belonging to the Universe in 1991, co-authored with David Steindl-Rast, a Benedictine monk considered to be a modern-day Thomas Merton. That book explores the parallels between new paradigm thinking in science and religion that together present what the authors perceive as a remarkably compatible view of the universe. The Science of Leonardo, 2007, and Learning from Leonardo, 2013, in which Dr. Capra explores Leonardo's scientific notebooks and his genius as a scientist. Dr. Capra introduces Leonardo da Vinci as the true founder of modern science and a systemic thinker in the 15th century. In The Web of Life, he introduced the notion of open systems and the importance of patterns, nonlinear thinking, and feedback loops in living systems. And in Hidden Connections, Dr. Capra explores cells, membranes, and metabolism, and their chemical networks. He shows that the network is the pattern of all life, and that chaos and self-organization, also known as emergence, are essential to understanding life. He leads the forefront in the call for the shift from object-based to relationship-based investigations. All of his books culminate in the seminal textbook, The Systems View of Life, 2014, a theoretical framework of deep ecology. Dr. Capra's works form a framework for a cultural critique of conventional linear thought and the mechanistic view of Descartes, exposing Descartes' reductionist view that everything can be studied in parts for understanding the whole. He facilitates readers to view the whole world system, research, and complexity theory. His ecological vision proposes that modern society abandon conventional linear thought, the mechanistic view of the universe, and develop a holistic science paradigm. He's been a pioneer of systems research at the forefront of the journey to the acceptance of systems thinking by a wide range of scholars. This journey actually began in 1905 with Einstein, when he wrote his first draft of special relativity theory, and accelerated in the 1960s. And it is Dr. Capra who worked through the intricacies of the mechanistic, dualistic, and reductionist paradigms that have dominated Western culture for approximately 400 years. So without further ado, Fritjof, please take over.
Thank you, Tara. Thank you for this very kind and very comprehensive introduction. I think I should hire you to introduce me at all my lectures and seminars and webinars, because you do it most impressively. Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be with SoL Singapore. I have known Peter Senge for a very long time, and I have spoken for various other SoL organizations, so I'm very happy to do this again. Well, when we look at the state of the world today, at our multifaceted global crisis, what is most evident is that none of our major problems, energy, environment, the climate emergency, economic inequality, and now the COVID pandemic, None of these problems can be understood in isolation. They are systemic problems, which means that they are all interconnected and interdependent. Let's take the COVID pandemic as an example, as it is on all of our minds. In my view, the coronavirus must be seen as a biological response of Gaia, our living planet, to the ecological and social emergency that humanity has brought upon itself. It arose from an ecological imbalance, and it has dramatic consequences because of social and economic imbalances. Our massive intrusion into ecosystems all over the world have fragmented these systems and have fractured the web of life. One of the many consequences of these harmful activities has been that viruses that used to live in symbiosis with certain animal species where they did no harm jumped from those species to others and to humans where they are toxic and even deadly. So in the 1960s, the HIV virus jumped from a rare species of monkeys into humans in Western Africa. And this year, the coronavirus jumped from a species of bats to humans in China, and from there rapidly spread around the world. Now, population density is a key variable in the spread of the pandemic. And population density is often a consequence of excessive profit maximizing. Whether we think about giant cruise ships or other forms of mass tourism, giant supermarkets, meatpacking factories, or crowded living situations caused by social and economic inequality. During a pandemic like COVID-19, social justice is no longer a political issue of left versus right, but has become an issue of life and death. When the pandemic spread around the world, one country after another went into lockdown, as we still are largely today. And as a consequence, the transportation of people and goods decreased dramatically. Businesses closed, unemployment soared, and together with the global health crisis, we are now having also a global economic crisis. However, from a planetary ecological point of view, there have also been many good consequences. As human activities decreased dramatically, the pollution of our major cities around the world suddenly disappeared, and we now enjoy again clear skies and clean air. Wildlife is flourishing in ecosystems around the world undisturbed by humans. The coronavirus has already been more effective in reducing CO2 emissions and slowing down the climate catastrophe than all political and other initiatives combined. Now, this does not mean that we want to go on like this, obviously not. The current environmental regeneration has been the consequence of radically reduced human activities. But the same consequences can be achieved by radically changing our human activities. With COVID-19, Gaia has presented us with valuable life-saving lessons. The question is, will humanity heed those lessons? Now, when we analyze the situation in more detail and in more depth, we soon discover that the fundamental dilemma underlying all our global problems is the illusion perpetuated by most of our economists and politicians that unlimited quantitative growth is possible on a finite planet. Perpetual growth, fueled by corporate greed, is pursued relentlessly by promoting excessive consumption and a throwaway economy that is energy and resource intensive, generating waste and pollution, depleting the Earth's natural resources, and increasing economic inequality. Moreover, these problems are exacerbated by global climate change, caused by our energy-intensive and fossil fuel-based technologies. Again, I want to emphasize how all these problems, economic inequality, pollution, resource depletion, and so on, are all systemically interconnected. So our key challenge is to shift from an economic system based on the notion of unlimited growth to one that is ecologically sustainable and socially just. No growth is not the answer, in my view, because growth is an essential property of all life. All living systems grow. But in nature, not everything grows at the same time. So while some parts, say, of an ecosystem grow, other parts reach their maturity and then decline and disintegrate, setting free their components, which become resources for new growth. This kind of balanced, multifaceted growth is well known to biologists and ecologists. I call it qualitative growth to distinguish it from the quantitative growth used by today's economists and measured by the GDP. In living organisms, ecosystems, and societies, qualitative growth includes an increase of complexity, maturity, and sophistication. So we need to qualify growth. Instead of assessing the state of an economy in terms of this undifferentiated, crude measurement of GDP, we need to distinguish between good growth and bad growth, and then increase the former at the expense of the latter. Now, from an ecological perspective, the distinction between good growth and bad growth is obvious. Bad growth is growth based on fossil fuels, growth that involves toxic substances, depletes natural resources, and degrades the Earth's ecosystems. Good growth is the opposite of all that. It is growth that involves renewable resources, zero emissions, continual recycling of natural resources, support of local communities, and restoration of the Earth's ecosystems. This focus on qualitative growth is fully consistent with a new conception of life that has emerged in science over the last 30 years. And as Tara mentioned, to explore this new conception of life has been my work over many decades. At the forefront of contemporary science, the universe is no longer seen as a machine consisting of some basic building blocks. We have discovered that the material world ultimately is an inseparable network of relationships. We've also discovered that the planet as a whole is a living, self-regulating and self-organizing system. The view of the human body, accordingly, as a machine, and of the mind as a separate entity, is now being replaced by one that sees not only the brain, but also the immune system, the bodily tissues, and in fact, every single cell as a living and cognitive system. Evolution is no longer seen as a competitive struggle for existence, but rather as a kind of cooperative dance in which creativity and the constant emergence of novelty are the driving forces. And with the new emphasis on complexity, networks, and patterns of organization, a whole new science of qualities is now slowly emerging. During the last 30 years, I developed a synthesis of this new understanding of life, a conceptual framework that integrates 4 dimensions of life: the biological dimension, obviously, but also the cognitive, the social, and the ecological dimension of life. I presented summaries of this framework as it evolved in several books. The last one, the textbook that Tara mentioned, The Systems View of Life, which I wrote with my friend and colleague Pierluigi Luisi. So I call my synthesis the systems view of life because it involves a new kind of thinking, well known to all of you, known as systemic thinking or systems thinking, which means thinking in terms of relationships, patterns, and context. Systems thinking is crucial for ecology because ecology, derived from the Greek word oikos, meaning household, ecology is the science of the relationships among all the members of the Earth household. Now, to present the systems view of life fully, I would need a whole seminar or a whole course. And as Garrett mentioned, I'm actually teaching such a course online. It's a course that consists of 12 lectures that are pre-recorded. And then we have an online discussion forum in which I participate during the entire 12 weeks of the course. So as Garrett mentioned, it's called Capra course and easy to find on the internet. I've now taught this course for over 4 years, and we have an alumni network of over 1,500 members around the world in about 70 countries. So now let me give you a few highlights of the systems view of life. At the very core is a profound change of metaphors from seeing the world as a machine to understanding it as a network. And a network, as everybody knows, is a certain pattern of links, of relationships. And therefore, in order to understand networks, we need to be able to think in terms of relationships and patterns. And of course, this is what systems thinking is all about. The recognition that networks are the basic pattern of organization of life is one of the most important insights of 20th century science. So whenever we look at life, we see networks. Ecosystems are understood in terms of food webs, that is, webs of organisms. Then organisms are networks of tissues, of organs. Organs are networks of cells. Cells are networks of molecules, and so on. So the network is a pattern that is common to all life. And closer examination of these networks has shown that their key characteristic is that they are self-generating. This is the theory of autopoiesis by Umberto Maturana and Francisco Varela, as Garrett has mentioned. I don't have time to go into the details of this theory, but let me just tell you that in a cell, for example, all the biological structures, the proteins, enzymes, the membranes, the DNA, RNA, all of these large molecules are continually generated, regenerated and recycled by the cellular network. And in the same way, in multicellular organisms, the organism's cells are continually regenerated and recycled. So the network, a living network continually creates or recreates itself. Life is continually regenerative. Now, as you know, life in the social realm can also be understood in terms of networks, but here we're not talking about chemical processes, we're talking about communications. As everybody knows today, social networks are networks of communications. And interestingly, like biological networks, they also regenerate themselves continually. Every communication generates ideas, information, values, meaning, and this gives rise to further communications. And in this way, the network continually generates itself. So we have biological networks that operate in the realm of matter, and then social networks that operate in the realm of meaning, a non-material realm, and both are continually self-generating. Now let me return to the systemic nature of our major global problems. Their interconnectedness and interdependence means that they require corresponding systemic solutions. That is, solutions that do not address and solve any problem in isolation, but always in relationship to other problems, always within the context of other related problems. And because of this, a systemic solution typically tends to solve several problems at the same time. Let me give you an example from the field of agriculture. If we changed globally from our chemical, large-scale industrial agriculture to organic, community-oriented, sustainable farming, this would contribute significantly to solving a whole range of our major problems. It would greatly reduce our energy dependence, because today industrial agriculture uses about 20% of our fossil fuel energy to grow, process, and transport food. The healthy, organically grown food would hugely improve public health, because we know well that many chronic diseases, such as heart disease, stroke, diabetes, and so on, are a direct consequence of our diet. Organic farming would also contribute significantly to address the climate emergency. Why? Because an organic soil is a living soil, which means that it is full of carbon. It draws down carbon from the atmosphere and locks it up in organic substances. So this is only one example of a systemic solution. Over the last few decades, the research institutes and centers of learning of the global civil society have developed and tested hundreds of such systemic solutions around the world. Those include proposals to reshape economic globalization and restructure corporations, new forms of ownership that are not extractive but are regenerative, a wide variety of systemic solutions to the interlinked problems of energy, food, poverty, and climate change. And finally, the large number of systemic design solutions known as eco-design, which incorporate the basic principles of ecology. In our textbook and in my online course, I include extensive reviews of the most important of these systemic solutions. And I come to the conclusion that today, the systemic understanding of life has given us the knowledge and the technologies to solve our major problems and build a sustainable future. The question is, will we have the political will and leadership? The world's COVID-19 response has shown what is possible when people realize that their lives are at stake. Our individual lives are at stake with the pandemic. Collectively, the life of civilization is at stake with the climate emergency. So will we have the wisdom and the political will to apply this lesson to the climate crisis and to our other global problems? Well, I'm going to end here, and I really look forward to more discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fritjof. Excuse me. Let me jump back in as soon as I'm allowed to in terms of video. But what I'm hearing from you is obviously, yeah, the interconnections that exist, and yet I wonder, given what we see in the approach of many leaders across the globe, very sort of reductionist, as we've been sort of, or rather society's reductionist approach, but also leaders' sort of fragmented approach to things. What do you think is the biggest gateway into bringing a more systemic framework into how people are currently making decisions as an educator?
Well, I think there are leaders and leaders, you know. Let's take again the COVID pandemic. You know, the worst leaders in the world are the American and the Brazilian president. The best leaders in the world are the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, and, you know, Angela Merkel in Germany, leaders in Norway, in Finland. You probably know that Finland has a whole government of women under 40. So these are tremendous leaders. In the United States, we have a group of young congresswomen with the leadership of the so-called AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. These are all leaders who are systemic thinkers. And then we have the large youth movements, you know, starting with Greta Thunberg, and not starting, but, you know, featuring especially Greta Thunberg in Sweden, but also the Sunrise Movement in the United States, the Extinction Rebellion in the UK, Fridays for Future, and so on. So I think strategically, the most important thing would be to bring the older generation, meaning us, you know, Peter Senge, myself, you know, Maturana, Hazel Henderson, Vandana Shiva, David Orr. I mean, there's a whole network of systemic thinkers who are now in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. And to bring those together with the young people who have the right, who share our values, who have tremendous passion and energy to bring about change, and to prevent them from having to reinvent the wheel, because we have worked for many decades, us elders, to work out a framework which is tested, which is coherent, which has, as I mentioned, these systemic solutions. To bring those groups together, the young people and the older systemic thinkers.
It's really about bringing some of the rising leaders into the fold,
yes,
to bring their advocacy. And we've seen, for those of you that haven't seen the video of Andrea Ocasio-Cortez's takedown of Ted Yoho, who is a representative from my district in Florida, from the Republican Party. It's quite something to behold. Her capacity and her power. So yes, she
yes,
is,
and also, you know, and also her legislation, the whole Green New Deal,
right, exactly. I was
which
gonna
she
say that.
co-sponsored with Bernie Sanders and others,
Yep.
is a systemic solution, because it
Oh.
says we will massively fund the shift from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources, and this will create millions of jobs.
Yep.
So at the same time, we are solving the energy crisis, the global climate emergency, and social inequality by creating these jobs.
Absolutely.
So these are tremendous efforts.
And for those of you that aren't sure why it's called the New Deal, is because it harkens back to Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal, which brought the U.S. back out of the Great Depression in the 1930s. And so this is the Green New Deal, which does a lot of the same thing, but from an environmental and social perspective, it seems.
Yes,
to me.
again, we can say that COVID-19 has been instrumental now in furthering these ideas, because before the pandemic, the Green New Deal was sort of, you know, poo-pooed and laughed about in the American Congress. Now it's seriously considered as a way out of the economic crisis. The same with, you know, universal guaranteed income and other measures, other social measures that are now seriously being considered.
Yeah. I think what COVID is done in a lot of ways too is to help people see the fact that everything is interconnected, right? That there's this virus that has taken down from one place across the globe. And so while the interconnections have been invisible to some extent, now they're much more sort of visible as they are. There is a question along that line I wanted to bring in from one of the attendees. That's thinking about some of the chaotic events, and this is from Mandar Vakili, who asks about does these current what seeming to be chaotic events, are they an indication of the living planet's self-organizing process? Does the planet have higher knowledge than its subnetworks, the plant species and humaning, as they say, to guide the process? This goes to your Gaia.
Well, yeah, yes and no. It is definitely a sign of the self-organization of Gaia, of the living planet, but it's not that the planet is conscious of it and says to herself, now, what could we do with those humans? Well, let's send them a virus. You know, it's not, that's not how it goes. So there are events and processes within the laws of physics and chemistry and within the complexity patterns that we are now beginning to understand, and they add up to this response. So it is a living organism that responds in a self-organizing way to these radical disturbances.
Thank you.
And it will go on, you know, after COVID, there will be other viruses unless we radically change. And we see already that, I just read today that in Vietnam, they are now outlawing the sale of wild animals, the trade of wild animals. This is one of the sources of the viruses. And of course, that's why they're outlawing it now. Should have been outlawed already a long time ago. And this is the other amazing thing with COVID. Many of the things we now recognize as impossible or unhealthy or harmful were already unhealthy and harmful a long time ago, like these meatpacking factories. They should have never existed in the first place. And now this is all brought into real time.
Excellent. Yes. And as we think about temperature rising as well from climate, as I understand in a way that there could potentially be increased diseases from that, spread of new diseases.
And there, you know, the amazing thought to consider is that if you look at Gaia as a living being, then you notice she has a fever.
Exactly.
And because we're cutting down the rainforest, she has a hard time breathing because we're decimating the lungs. Well, those are the COVID symptoms, exactly.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
there's a mirror of, you know, as above, so below.
Yeah, great. So I'd like to turn to Tara, who has a question that she'd like to ask as well.
Yeah, so just to clarify, I hear you saying that we really need to take the older leaders and the younger leaders who understand regenerative processes to, as a key leverage point, getting them together as a key leverage point that systems thinkers, activists could focus their intentions and actions to achieve maximum impact. Are there any others that you see that we should be focusing on?
Any others what?
Any other key leverage points that would support the shift that needs to happen?
Well, those are, you know, some of the things I have mentioned. We need to realize that the obsession with unlimited growth underlies virtually all our global problems. And so to bring that to the fore and to make people aware, you know, economists, politicians, business leaders, that this obsession with unlimited quantitative growth is totally irrational and schizophrenic, if you wish, or psychotic, if you wish. So to really put this on the table, you know, in business circles and so on, and say we need to shift from this unlimited GDP growth to qualitative growth or qualitative development, whatever language you want to use, but this shift needs to happen, and then a lot of things will follow.
So in Mr. Everyman terms, Mr. Everyman consumer, stopping and not consuming as much would have an enormous, you know, and also empower, I think, the individuals in doing that.
Yes, and also, you know, consuming, depending on what we consume, you know, in terms of food and so on. But we always need to remember, Tara, that the individual is embedded in a social and political system. So, for instance, in the United States, as in many other places, racism is embedded in the system. That's of course a major talking point these days since George Floyd. And so when we say we need to consume well, many Black people in this country don't have access to good food because they live in what is known as food deserts. So there is no healthy food in their immediate neighborhood because they are disadvantaged economically. You know, food markets that sell organically grown food do not open in these neighborhoods and so on. So the inherent racism that is embedded in the system is something that needs to be addressed, and of course something that is being addressed now.
Thank you.
Thank you. So there's a couple of questions about indigenous, so the wisdom that comes from indigenous populations or even ancient civilizations, the things that we have in our capitalistic system and our reductionist approach that we've lost a little bit of. And I was wondering if you could speak to that. There's two people, Salman and Bunyang, who have asked about that general topic around sort of what can we draw from them, and how do we reignite that in the larger population?
Well, you know, this is how I started out. You know, I was trained as a physicist. I was very interested in the philosophy of quantum theory and relativity theory, influenced a lot by Werner Heisenberg. And then in the 60s, I began to study Eastern philosophies, Eastern mystical traditions. I practiced meditation. I experimented with psychedelics. And during those heady times, I realized gradually that there's a whole coherent worldview embodied in these Eastern spiritual traditions that is completely in harmony with the views that were emerging from modern physics at the beginning of the 20th century. And then from there, I went on to write my second book, The Turning Point, which is, if you read it carefully, it's now outdated largely, but it was published in 1982, but it's really structured, or let's say it is guided by Eastern wisdom very much. I refer to it again and again. And then in subsequent decades, I realized that this kind of spirituality and wisdom is also present in other places, and especially in indigenous traditions. Tara mentioned that I'm a co-founder of the Center for Eco-Literacy in Berkeley, working in education. And we have worked with indigenous leaders extensively to create an ecologically oriented pedagogy. In particular with a leader called Jeanette Armstrong from British Columbia, from the Okanagan Nation of indigenous people in Canada. So I've become more and more aware also of indigenous wisdom. And you know, the two questioners are completely right. There is this very strong harmony and coherence between the system's view of life and indigenous traditions.
Mm. And in terms of that connection with spirituality, Mei Chuen had asked a while back to me, a woman named Mei Chuen, or can you explain spirituality from a systems perspective? So you're seeing a bit of the connection, but can you actually explain spirituality?
Yes, absolutely. And in my course, I actually have a whole lecture about that, about science and spirituality. And I start from the original meaning of spirit, which comes from the Latin spiritus, meaning breath. And it's the same as in inspiration and perspiration, conspiration, and so on. So spirit is breath. And interestingly, the same root meaning holds also for the related word, Latin word anima for soul, the Sanskrit Atman, the Greek psyche. All these words have the same root meaning of breath, which means that spirit or soul was conceived by the ancients as the breath of life. So then our spiritual moments are the moments where we feel most alive. Spiritual experience can be seen as an experience of intense aliveness. And in these moments of intense aliveness, which I think most of us have experienced, either in meditation or when engaging with a work of art, you know, a piece of music, in sports, in a sexual encounter, in many, many ways, we can experience these moments of intense aliveness where the self sort of dissolves and you become one with the world. That is the key characteristic of spiritual experience. Mm-hmm. So this is an experience that is common to all humanity, that has happened in all different cultures and eras. And what people do then, very often when they have this experience, they want to share it with others. So they get organized and they form a community, which is a religious community. So religion I see as the interpretation of the spiritual experience for a particular religious community. And this interpretation is always dependent on the cultural context and the historical context, whereas the spiritual experience is context-free. It's just the human experience of aliveness. Religion is always context-oriented, and very often what we have seen in religions is that they forget the original spiritual inspiration and become dogmatic and fundamentalist. So all of this I discuss in the textbook and in a special lecture in the course.
Yeah, I came across that part in the textbook, so I'm about 42% of the way through it. But I came across that breath, which made me feel like, oh, you know, there's this connection with mindfulness and meditative states, because that's
absolutely. Yeah.
Mindfulness
is exactly what it is. An awareness of mind and body as a unity. That's what mind, an intense awareness.
That's excellent connection. Thank you. I want to turn it back over to Tara, because she might actually have a follow-on question related to that she'd like to ask you, or another.
Yes, you are a Buddhist practitioner and a Catholic practitioner. And I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about the mental model that you hold that enables you to embrace both of these philosophies.
I didn't get the beginning. You said, which are the two philosophies?
You are a Buddhist practitioner, I understand, and you are a Catholic practitioner, or have been. And I'm wondering how you, what your, if you could elaborate on your mindset. Yeah.
No, I'm afraid I was raised as a Catholic, but left the Catholic Church in my late teenage years, and I'm not a great fan of Catholicism. And although I do appreciate the Pope's encyclical Laudato Si, which is an ecological encyclical, and he's a great environmental leader, but in other parts I differ very much from the Catholic Church. And I wouldn't call myself a practicing Buddhist either, but I'm very close to Buddhism. And I mean, if we extend it a little bit, I could say I'm a practicing Buddhist. I would accept that. But that is, Buddhism, as I showed in my first book, The Tao of Physics, and as we also show in the systems view of life, Buddhism and the systems view of life are extremely close.
Right. Thank you for clarifying that. There's some incorrect information out there that are
We are living in a post-truth society, even about Fritjof.
Yes.
So actually getting to some of the things that have influenced you, there is a question on what, who are some of the key influential thinkers that have inspired or motivated you the most? And it could be in either direction.
Yeah, well, this is a very big question, and I could talk for at least half an hour just listing them. Just to mention a few, I've mentioned Werner Heisenberg, who was a great influence in physics. Then later in my physics career, I spent 20 years doing research in theoretical physics, in high energy physics. And later in my career, I worked with Jeffrey Chu at the Lawrence Berkeley Lab in Berkeley, who was a great inspiration too. Then in terms of systems thinking, Gregory Bateson was a great inspiration. I already mentioned Umberto Maturana, Francisco Varela. Lynn Margulis was a great inspiration, the microbiologist and co-founder of the Gaia Theory. And then, in the social realm, I would say Manuel Castells, a sociologist who writes about the network society. Margaret Wheatley and Peter Senge, who both work in organizational theory. I would also say in terms of mind and consciousness, I would say Stan Groff was a big inspiration, Adi Lang. And then there's the whole area of feminism and ecofeminism. I would mention Vandana Shiva, Charlene Spretnak, Adrienne Rich, Carolyn Merchant. So it goes on and on. In spirituality, I would say Satish Kumar, the founder of Schumacher College, is now a good friend of mine, very, very inspiring mentor. So those are just a few.
Yeah, and you're on the faculty of Schumacher College.
That's right, yes.
Right, yes. Oh, excellent. I was hoping you might say Jiddu Krishnamurti. But,
well, Krishnamurti was a big inspiration, but a sort of like a flash of lightning during a very short period, which really solved a major existential problem for me. And then, I read a lot of his writings, but he was not an ongoing influence.
Yes, right. That was when you were at UC Santa Cruz.
Right, in the 60s, in the late 60s.
Yes, excellent. Stepping back for a moment into the current sort of framing that we live in and recognizing the impact that corporations have and consumers as well. But there's the corporate thought, right? So there's a question from Janet Lim around anywhere that you found to apply the framework that you have into organizations and consideration of business outcomes.
Well, there are organizations that, as I put it in my writings, bring life into human organizations by applying a systemic perspective, and these tend to have, acknowledge the existence of informal networks that exist in every organization, known these days as communities of practice. They tend to flatten their hierarchies, have self-organizing teams, and so on. And so there are many organizations of this kind. I think you guys know more about that than I do, because that's what your practice is about. But what comes to mind is, for instance, the Gore of the producers of Gore-Tex. They are an early pioneer of organizations like that. Or I have worked with a company called Natura in Brazil. They sell cosmetics, and they're all based on networks. Patagonia and Esprit in the old days in the United States, and there are many others. But Garrett, I'm not a consultant, so I don't go into organizations and work with them. I'm invited to seminars either for one organization or where several organizations come. And so that's how I meet them.
Yes, and I saw and I apologize, I don't mean to put you in an awkward position with that, but I was just curious if there was any connections that we hadn't seen that you had made, that you might have some contribution to in that realm. But I did see last year, I think it was in September, your discussion with the healthcare industry on a systems view of health. And looking at that. And I thought that was really intriguing, and considering that from an industry perspective, that there is a position that you take.
I've worked on this for a long time, and I did actually speak at many health conferences. And again, in the textbook, I have a chapter on the systems view of health, and in the course, I have a lecture on the systems view of health. So that's one of the areas that I've worked a lot. But again, I wouldn't go into a hospital and talk to the leadership or the staff. That's not the kind of work I do.
Excellent. Thank you.
I should also mention that I've worked a lot in Italy, and there is a company called Aboca, and they produce medicinal herbs, and they're totally, clean, a clean production process, totally sustainable and regenerative. And they also have a publishing line, and they publish some of my books, notably the textbook. And their management and leadership is also adopting the systems approach. So that would be another example.
Tara, we'll turn back to you.
Yeah, just considering, of course, I'm now not sure this was fake news, but I understand that you are consulting to governments on policy, and am curious to know if you think there are some governments that are more receptive to these changes than others, given the leaders. We know who the leading countries are, that's very clear.
Yeah.
But are there other countries that are in the midst of some serious change?
I think, Tara, you give me too much credit. I'm not a consultant to governments. I wish I were, but I'm not. But let me tell you a story. Many years ago, during the Obama administration, I was invited to Washington, D.C. by the State Department at the time when Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State Department. And they had a small symposium of around 30 people. And the theme of it was policy making in a networked world. And it was extremely interesting, but at the same time, extremely frustrating, because they had invited people from Congress and people from the executive, from the White House, and nobody came. You know, so there was just a small group, and they were not able to communicate this with the Obama administration. Obama had his own circle of people from Chicago, and they were sort of, you know, closed and not open to these inputs. And this is true for most governments. Today, you can say that we have 3 segments of society which are centers of power. And the first 2 are the usual, the traditional government and business. And now the third one, we have civil society. We have, as you know, a global civil society. And I think these systemic solutions need to be elaborated and applied in a collaborative effort between government, business, and civil society. And this brings me back to what we talked about before, leverage points. That would be a huge leverage point, to get representatives from these 3 centers of power together. And this is very, very difficult. And I remember at this symposium in Washington, I presented, you know, the systems thinking and the importance of networks and so on. And so one government official said, well, if we work in a network, who gets the credit? So this is very typical of politics, because, you know, they're interested in getting the credit, in having political power, in having influence. Working in a network is not exactly what they want to do. Now, again, you know, the young generation of politicians is different. And so hopefully this will change.
Mm. Interestingly enough, I'm part of an organization I helped to found about 5 years ago called Mother Earth. And one of the new aspirations of that organization is to bring together these 3 parts of society to engage in dialogue, and think of like Bohmian, right? David Bohmian dialogue and a framing of systems thinking together to really help understand from different perspectives.
The three bring different things to the table. You know, government has the legislative power, and government officials like our Governor Gavin Newsom in California, or, you know, the president or a senator or a congresswoman like AOC, they have the power of the microphone, and they get heard. Business is very good in designing practical solutions, communication systems, you know, distribution systems, all kinds of things. And civil society has the values and the way of thinking that is needed. And so when the 3 get together, I think can be very powerful.
Thank you. Last question I have is around emergence. And it's something I'm seeing as a theme that's in the book. I don't think you've covered it so far as a separate topic, but I was wondering if you could speak to this idea of I don't know, a sort of connection of emergence and a broader sense of consciousness. I guess I have 2 sort of questions. One is around general emergence, and the other is around a potential sense of collective consciousness, if that actually might exist in our world, maybe from the Gaia perspective or others. Do you have any sense on that, or any view on that?
Well, emergence, I mentioned emergence very briefly when in my talk, when I talked about evolution being a kind of dance where the constant emergence of novelty is the guiding force. So, and to me, this process of emergence, the discovery and understanding of this process of emergence, is the most important result of complexity theory. We now know that all living systems, all living organisms, not only are capable of maintaining themselves in a balanced state, but occasionally encounter points of instability, of imbalance. And at these points of instability, they may either break down, or what happens much more frequently, they may break through to a new state, a new order. And this breakthrough, this emergence of novelty, is the source of creativity in life. So the big discovery is that all life is creative. It's not, you know, we used to think that who is creative? Well, artists are creative. You know, some scientists are creative. But all human beings are creative. Not only all human beings, but my cat is creative, because all animals are creative, all plants are creative. Creativity is an inherent quality of life. That's the big discovery. And so emergence is the main avenue of evolution. The emergence of novelty is the main avenue of evolution. So that's another thing we haven't talked about. There's a whole systems view of evolution, which is very exciting and very new. And maybe we have to have another webinar for that, because that's another big subject.
Absolutely. I have to say, I'm really enjoying the textbook. There's the part where your Dr. Luisi has lost me a little bit in terms of some of the details into the genetic and chemical framing of it. But
me too. I have to tell you, I have a hard time understanding his biochemistry.
Yes,
but it's very good because it rounds out the book and gives it more depth. You know?
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you.
We have about 5 minutes left,
or
more, actually 7. Is there any brief, do you expand just slightly on the emergence of novelty and evolution a little further for us?
Well, what we have discovered is that there are 3 avenues of evolution, and this is largely the work of Lynn Margulis. One is genetic mutation, which we have known, you know, ever almost since Darwin. Genetic mutations are chance changes in the genetic copying process. But the second one, more important, is the exchange of genetic materials among bacteria, the so-called gene trading. And the third one is the acquiring of entire bacterial genomes by higher organisms, by multicellular organisms. And this is known as symbiogenesis. This is a symbiosis that generates new features or new species. And that was mainly the work of Lynn Margulis. So all these avenues create genetic novelty. But creating genetic novelty is not the whole story, because then this genetic novelty has to be integrated into what exists already, into the cellular environment and the larger environment of the organism. And this process of integration is a highly ordered, self-organizing, and ultimately cognitive process. So although there are chance elements in evolution, it's by no means all chance. It's mostly a very ordered, complex, and ultimately cognitive process. That's the big discovery of the systems view of evolution.
Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So we are pretty much at the close. Is there any concluding remarks before I move into sort of what we're going to be potentially looking as we move forward? Is there any concluding remarks?
No, I just want to thank you again for this conversation, which has been very stimulating. And I want to come back of these ideas of somehow combining the wisdom of the elders and the energy and passion of the youth. If you as Global SoL could be instrumental in facilitating that, you would do a tremendous service to the world at large.
And I think that's partly what we aim to do. I think that's what we are involved in and our goals, and I think we recognize that. However, that needs to be done. But like you said, there are strengths of the different components, right? So as you said, the vocal, the ability to get the word out rests with a lot of the politicians and the government perspectives. But there, I think, is an avenue on the corporate side too. So how do we partner with them to really bring that out? And there are other organizations to partner with, right? So we can collaborate with other organizations focused on the same thing. So thank you. Good. So I am going to go back and share my screen so I can wrap this up. So everybody, please stay with us. We may run over by just a minute, but would love to get some of your thoughts. So in the chat, to everybody, one of the things that we're exploring is that we're thinking about how do we bring what Fritjof has discussed with us today and some of his teachings into a real application orientation. And many of the questions that you've asked, and I apologize for not being able to get to all the questions that you've asked. But how do we potentially explore some of that? Because some of the questions that have been asked is, well, what's this look like, right? How do we apply this? And I think that we are thinking about running a workshop that would allow for us to explore what that looks like. So it wouldn't be in a webinar. So I'm seeing a lot of yeses come through in the chat, which is wonderful. Thank you. If you've got a no as well, that's fine. But it sounds like this has made a bit of an impact. So thank you, Fritjof, for all of your sharing here.
Right.
I think the challenge is here is like, what does this mean for us, right? What do we do with this? And then, so that's one of the framings that we as SoL Singapore are exploring, as well as the global organization of SoL. So wonderful. Okay. So before we go there, before we end, rather, I want to just introduce if I can get to the next topic, which is the next event, I guess you might say, which is a mental models workshop. And I introduced earlier the 5 disciplines. The first one, systems thinking, was covered by Robert Steele and Peter Sia. And a couple of us are going to be running a mental models workshop that's going to be limited to, I think, about 40 people. And just to introduce to you what the mental models mean in the systems context, is just recognizing that, as we've discussed earlier on in this dialogue with Fritjof, that there are events in the world that happen. And things around climate change, specifically, we might see things around deforestation, people that die from the floods, right? All these are events that relate to climate. And so there are things that we see. If we start to think about them over time, if you want to look at it in terms of a behavior over time graph, we see a bit of pattern, right, to what's happening. And so we can map that out in terms of pattern to see global temperatures, to see the cost of climate or level of deforestation. And so it's recognizing what those patterns are. And that's part of what systems thinking is being able to see patterns instead of events. And underneath those patterns, what determines those patterns are the systemic structures, right? The cause and effect relationships that we've been talking about to some degree here, and largely what you'll hear about when you think about systems thinking is what are the feedback loops that exist, right? Balancing and reinforcing feedback loops, and how do they interact together. And so Peter Senge, for instance, has a number of systems archetypes that show some of the regular behavior patterns that occur in systems, and what do the relationships look like, and how do we identify the leverage points. So that's a systemic structure. What is underneath that and determines those systemic structures are the mental models that we have. And so we've talked about, and some of you have asked about this in your comments, your questions, around the consumption, right? The idea that we're consuming things. And so what is our mental model around consumption? What is our mental model around the resources? Just terming that frame of resources, right, isn't itself a mental model. That's the way that we see the natural environment as a resource. And so how do we understand those mental models? How do we unearth them, uncover them, and understand the assumptions that we make? And so in this workshop, we'll be discussing that and understanding a little bit of what that means, and how do we potentially shift some of our own mental models, because it starts with ourselves, as well as to engage with larger groups and understanding what are some of the mental models that the groups themselves hold. So we'll be exploring that in an interactive session for about an hour and a half. It's going to be virtual on August 22nd. So I have here for you the QR code that you can jump onto to register. It's also on Eventbrite. If you want to search mental models on Eventbrite, I'm sure that you will find it. This is not yet posted onto the SoL Singapore website, so you're not going to find that, but it is open onto Eventbrite. You can access that Eventbrite through the QR code. Spaces are limited, however. Okay, so I wanted to stop there and ask for any further comments.
Yes, I just want to thank Fritjof for a really rich and exciting time today. and very, very meaningful. Thank you for being so generous to join us.
Okay, thank you. Goodbye,
Thank
everybody.
you.